They called them Invincible. Hidden deep in volcanic rock, protected by cliffs, concrete, and centuries of warrior tradition, Japan's island fortresses were meant to be death traps for any invader foolish enough to land. With more than 110,000 men stationed across these isolated strongholds, they prepared for a brutal fight to the last man. Bunkers were dug into hillsides, artillery concealed in jungle shadows, and tunnels connected chambers that could withstand bombs, shells, even fire. Japanese commanders were confident no force on earth would breach these steel-reinforced islands. But what happened next left even their fiercest generals in stunned disbelief. Because the Americans didn't even try to land. By late 1944, Japan had poured manpower, concrete, and blood into island defenses like Rabaul Truck, and bypassed outposts scattered across the Pacific. Each garrison, supplied at enormous cost, waited patiently, rifles ready, for the U.S. invasion they believed was coming. Soldiers trained daily, endured jungle rot, dug deeper into the earth, and rehearsed suicidal charges they were convinced would be necessary when the enemy came ashore. But General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz had studied the terrain, the logistics, and most importantly, the psychology of the war. They knew Japan had overcommitted to a strategy built on assumption that the Americans would play by the same brutal island-hopping rules forever. So instead of launching head-on assaults that would cost tens of thousands of lives, the Americans simply changed the game. They flew over these islands, they sailed around them. They choked them off from supplies, cut underwater cables, destroyed nearby airfields, and isolated the invincible fortresses in silence. What was once the pride of Japanese engineering became a tomb. Men starved, ammunition rusted, radios fell silent. The enemy never came, but the war still crushed them slowly, mercilessly. At Rabaul, one of the largest Japanese strongholds in the Pacific, over 65,000 troops were entrenched in what was considered an unbreachable defensive labyrinth. The terrain was jagged, the air thick with tropical heat and mosquitoes. American planes pounded the surrounding area for months, destroying fuel depots, piers, and roads. But they never invaded. Instead, the U.S. Navy dropped mines into the harbor and set up airstrips on nearby islands. Rabaul was strangled into irrelevance, its troops abandoned by Tokyo, left to rot. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "We do not fear death. But to be forgotten left here like ghosts is the cruelest fate." And it wasn't just Rabaul. Across the Pacific, Japanese troops in fortified bunkers would hear the distant hum of B-29 bombers overhead, never knowing if the next sound would be the crash of explosives or if they would be ignored again. The uncertainty drove some to madness. For a culture that valued the glory of the decisive battle, being bypassed was worse than defeat. It was dishonor without redemption. As the U.S. leapfrogged from island to island, choosing targets that mattered strategically and skipping those that didn't, morale among Japanese forces began to crack. Starvation and tropical disease claimed more lives than bullets. Entire units died in silence, with no one to report their sacrifice. But here's where the story sharpens. Because while Japan spent decades designing fortresses that could resist fire, steel, and flesh, they never imagined their greatest threat would be indifference. And the emotional twist? American families who feared their sons would face suicidal charges and hand-to-hand death on every island. Those parents, those sweethearts, would later learn that some of the deadliest islands were never fought for at all. Victory came not through the loss of life, but through the wisdom of choosing where not to fight. And what happened to the 110,000 Japanese troops inside those fortresses? That's where the ending hits hardest. Deep within the bunkers of Japan's so-called impregnable island fortresses, the silence became unbearable. After years of preparation, of promises from their commanders, of speeches about honor and resistance, there was nothing, no invasion. No chance to die in a glorious last stand. Only the sound of the jungle reclaiming the soil, the buzz of insects, and the slow gnawing of hunger and isolation. One Japanese private, stationed on an island bypassed by the Americans, later wrote, "We were trained to fight to the death. But no one told us how to survive being forgotten." Across the Pacific, over 110,000 Japanese soldiers sat trapped inside islands that no longer mattered. Fortresses meant to repel invasion became open-air prisons. Cut off from supplies, rations dwindled. Medical care vanished. Officers broke down. The proud imperial units resorted to boiling bark, eating rats, even scavenging from the dead. Some soldiers went blind from malnutrition. Some walked into the sea. Others chose suicide, ashamed that no enemy had even thought them worthy enough to fight. Meanwhile, the American war machine surged forward. Using radar, reconnaissance planes, and high-level strategic mapping, commanders avoided costly ground battles that Japan had bet everything on. Why charge into death when you could just fly over it? For every fortress skipped, thousands of American lives were saved. Parents back home in Missouri, New York, Ohio who had braced for a telegram that would shatter their world watched in awe as their sons returned not in caskets, but with medals and stories of bypassed death. And the Japanese commanders? They knew their strategy had collapsed. Their doctrine was built around glorious attrition, around bleeding the enemy dry in jungle hellscapes. But MacArthur and Nimitz refused to play by those rules. They rewrote the book. They flew past fixed defenses. They struck at oil supplies, communication centers, and key airfields. Suddenly, the Invincible didn't matter. Perhaps the most haunting irony of all is this. In constructing these massive strongholds, Japan committed enormous manpower and resources to defending what would become strategically irrelevant. Fortifications that took years to build were undone in weeks, not by combat, but by neglect. In the end, when Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, most of the men in those bunkers had not fired a single shot. They emerged from tunnels. Some barefoot, some trembling, their uniforms shredded by jungle thorns, emaciated, sunken-eyed, silent. When American forces finally landed months, sometimes years later, they found ghost cities. Maps, rifles, artillery, and journals filled with unanswered questions. One chilling note read, "The Emperor told us to resist. Why didn't they come? Because America didn't need to." That's the painful truth Japan couldn't accept. They had built fortresses expecting bullets, bayonets, and blood. But what destroyed them was a different weapon, entirely strategy. Let that sink in. In a war full of brutal clashes and horrific losses, some of the greatest victories came not from firepower, but from choosing when not to fight. And if you think this story is powerful, just wait until you hear what happened when Japan tried to ambush American warships in total darkness, only to be hit from 8 miles away before they even saw the enemy. That's a story you won't forget. Make sure to like, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for more untold truths from W2. Because these aren't just stories of history, they're lessons in courage, failure, and the unseen power of thinking differently.